Martha Kessler had no intention of finding anything that morning beyond a clean patch of ground behind her barn. The brush had been piling up for 4 decades, long before she ever set foot on the property, and she had decided that this was the season to finally burn it away. The wind was low. The sky was the color of weak coffee. She carried a bucket of water in one hand and a bundle of dry matches in her apron pocket, and she told herself, as she always did on chore mornings, that there was nothing romantic about burning brush. It was simply something that needed doing before the ground froze. She was 26 years old, and she had lived on this ranch in the Wyoming Territory for only 4 years, since she married Everett Kessler at 22 and came out from her family's farm in Missouri to make a life with him. Everett had died the previous winter, thrown from a horse in a ravine 2 miles from the house, and since then she had run the place alone with the help of a hired hand who came twice a week and a nephew of Everett's who visited when the mood struck him. The ranch was modest, 40 acres of grazing land and a small herd of cattle that had dwindled since Everett's death. And the barn behind which she now stood had been standing long before either of them arrived. She remembered her first months on the ranch clearly, the strangeness of a house that was not yet home, the barn that Everett told her had come with the land itself, weathered gray even then, purchased along with the property from a man named Owen Pruitt, who had moved on west a full generation before either of them was born. Everett had mentioned Pruitt only once or twice, always in passing, always as a name with no real story attached to it. He had not thought the man worth much curiosity, and Martha, young and busy learning to run a household on land she barely knew, had not thought to ask further. The brush pile stretched nearly 30 feet along the back wall of the barn, a tangle of dead sagebrush, broken fence rails, and years of accumulated deadfall that nobody had bothered to clear, not by Everett, and certainly not by whoever had worked the land before him. It had simply grown there, season after season, the way neglected corners of a property always seem to gather what nobody wants to deal with, until it became one more thing Martha inherited when Everett died, along with debts she had not known about and chores she was only slowly learning the rhythm of. Martha struck the match against her boot heel and watched the flame catch. She touched it to the driest part of the pile, near the base, and stepped back as the fire began to work its way through the brush. It was slow going at first. The wood was old and packed tight in places, and it took the better part of an hour of careful feeding and shifting before the whole pile was burning steadily, sending up a column of gray smoke that drifted east over the pasture. She stood back from the heat with her rake in hand, feeding stray branches into the flames when they threatened to smother themselves, and thought about how strange it was that a chore this simple could feel so significant. 40 years of accumulated brush did not disappear easily. It resisted the fire in places, damp at the core where rain had soaked into the deepest layers over the decades, and she found herself having to work the pile apart with the rake to let the flames reach the wetter wood beneath. She was not looking for stone steps. She was looking for the fire to finish so she could get on with the rest of her chores, the milking and the mending, and the letter she owed her mother back in Missouri. But as the flames worked down through the pile, eating away at 40 years of accumulated brush, something began to emerge from beneath the ash that she had never seen before. At first it looked like nothing more than a flat gray rock, the kind of thing a person might find scattered anywhere across that stretch of territory. But as more of the brush burned away, she saw that it was not one rock. It was several, arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be natural. She waited until the fire had burned down to embers before she approached. The ground near the base of the pile was still warm, and she could feel the heat rising through the soles of her boots as she crouched down to look more closely. What she found were 3 flat stones, each roughly 2 feet across, set into the earth in a line, rising slightly one above the other. They looked, unmistakably, like the beginning of a staircase. "That is not something I put there," she said aloud, to no one because there was no one else behind the barn to hear her. She stood and looked at the barn wall, trying to remember whether Everett had ever mentioned anything about digging or building behind it. She could not recall a single conversation on the subject in all their years together, few as those years had been. The barn had been standing since long before either of them, built by the previous owner of the land, a man named Owen Pruitt, who had sold the property to Everett's father and moved on west decades earlier. She had heard his name mentioned only a handful of times, mostly in passing, mostly forgotten. She fetched a rake from the barn and used it to clear the remaining ash away from the stones, careful not to disturb them. Beneath the ash, the stone was cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding ground, and when she pressed her palm flat against the top step, she felt a strange chill pass up through her wrist that had nothing to do with the temperature of the morning. The steps did not stop at 3. As she cleared more ash, she found a 4th step, and then what appeared to be the edge of a 5th, disappearing beneath a section of undisturbed earth that the fire had not yet touched. She spent the rest of the morning clearing brush that had not burned, exposing more of the strange stone structure, until by early afternoon she had uncovered 5 full steps leading down into the earth at an angle, disappearing beneath a slab of packed dirt that looked as though it had settled there undisturbed for years. Her hands were blistered from the rake handle, and her dress was streaked with ash, but she did not stop until the light began to fail, and she could no longer see clearly what she was doing. That evening she rode into town to see her neighbor, a rancher named Walter Doss, who had known Everett since boyhood and who had a reputation for being unimpressed by most things. "You rode 2 miles to tell me about a rock pile," Walter said, standing in his doorway with a lantern in one hand. "It is not a rock pile," Martha said. "It is stone steps, cut and set deliberate. Behind my barn, under 40 years of brush." Walter frowned. "Could be an old root cellar. People used to dig those close to the house." "Then why are they behind the barn and not the house?" "Could be the house moved. Could be the barn used to sit somewhere else." "The barn has not moved a foot in as long as anyone can remember, Walter. You helped Everett reshingle it yourself 2 summers back." He considered this. "Then I do not know what to tell you, Martha. Could be a dug well that somebody covered over. Could be anything." "I want you to come look at it," she said. "Tomorrow, in daylight." He agreed, mostly, she suspected, to put an end to the conversation, and the next morning he arrived on horseback with a shovel tied to his saddle and an expression that suggested he still believed this to be a waste of a morning. He crouched at the edge of the exposed steps for a long moment, running his thumb along the cut edge of the top stone. The steps had been carved with tools. That much was clear from the marks along the sides, chisel marks that had not softened much despite what must have been years of weather before the brush ever piled on top of them. "That is fine stonework," he admitted finally. "Somebody spent real time on this." "That is what I thought. But it is not a well. Wells are round. This is a stair, going down at an angle, not straight." He looked up at her. You know what this ranch used to be before Everett's father bought it?"
"Owen Pruitt's land," she said. "That is all I know."
"That is all anybody knows anymore," Walter said. "But my father used to talk about him. Said Pruitt was here before the town was much of a town at all. Before the war, even. Said he kept to himself mostly. My father used to say Pruitt built something behind his barn that nobody understood. And when Pruitt sold the land and moved on, nobody thought much more about it."
"Built what?"
"I do not know, Martha. My father never said. Or maybe he never knew either. Just that there was talk." They spent the rest of that day digging, carefully, alternating turns with the shovel, clearing packed dirt away from the steps, one careful layer at a time. The work was slower than either of them expected. The dirt had compacted hard over the decades, and in places they had to break it apart with a pick before the shovel could move it. By late afternoon, they had uncovered 11 steps in total, descending at a steep angle into the earth, ending at what appeared to be a low stone archway, half collapsed, leading into darkness beyond.
"I am not going in there today," Walter said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool weather.
"Light is going, and I do not particularly want to be the man who tells folks I got buried alive digging up Martha Kessler's brush pile."
"Tomorrow, then," Martha said.
That night she could not sleep. She lay in the bed she had shared with Everett for 4 short years and thought about the cold stone beneath her palm, the strange chill that had passed through her hand when she first touched it. She thought about Owen Pruitt, a man she had never met, who, according to Walter's father, had built something behind the barn that nobody understood. She thought, too, about how odd it was that a piece of land so unfamiliar to her, walked over countless times in her brief years here, could still hold something she had never once suspected. The following morning, 3 more people arrived to help with the excavation, word having traveled through the small community the way word always did. Among them was an older man named Frank Osei, who had lived in the territory since before the railroad came through, and who was known locally as something of an amateur historian, a man who collected old newspapers and land deeds the way other men collected rifles or horses. A second neighbor, a quiet widower named Robert Finch, who kept bees 3 miles to the north, came along mostly out of curiosity, though he offered little beyond an extra pair of hands and an occasional skeptical remark about wasted labor. "Owen Pruitt," Frank said when Martha told him the name. "I know that name. Give me until this afternoon."
"You are certain it is worth the trip?" Robert said, leaning on his shovel. "Could just as easily be an old cistern somebody dug and forgot. People bury all manner of foolishness out here and call it mysterious later."
"Then come see for yourself before you decide," Martha said, and led him to the archway. He looked at it for a long while without speaking, running his hand along the chiseled stone the same way Walter had. Whatever doubt he carried seemed to soften somewhat at the sight of the careful joinery, though he did not say so outright. "Well," he said finally, "it is finer work than most cisterns I have seen." Frank rode back to his own place, a small house on the edge of town, crowded with boxes of paper he had accumulated over 30 years, and returned by early afternoon with a leather folder full of documents. Pruitt filed a land claim in this territory back in 1853, Frank said,
spreading the papers carefully across the tailgate of his wagon. "Before there was much of anything out here, before the town had a name, even. He built this barn the same year, according to the claim records." "And the steps?" "Nothing in the land records about steps, but I found something else." He pulled out a yellowed page, a copy of an old newspaper notice from a town 40 miles east, dated 1858. "This is a notice about a group of families organizing what they called a cooperative cellar system. Families who did not have money for individual ice houses or root cellars pooled their labor together and built shared underground storage, dug into hillsides or behind barns where the earth held cold. One cellar could serve 4 or 5 families if it was built deep enough and insulated right." "You think that is what this is?" "I think it is possible." The notice mentions a builder by the name of a Pruitt, first initial O, contracted to design and oversee construction of 3 such cellars in this county alone. Man apparently had a reputation for building them deep and cutting stone steps instead of wood ladders, on account of wood rotting faster in that kind of damp. Martha felt something settle in her chest, a small and quiet excitement she had not expected. Why would he seal it up and leave, if it served that many families? "That I do not know," Frank admitted. "Records get thin after the war. A lot of families moved on, moved west, moved back east. Maybe the cooperative broke up. Maybe there was a falling out. Maybe it just stopped being needed once the railroad came through and folks could ship ice in instead of storing food underground all winter." Robert Finch, still standing nearby, shook his head slowly. "It is a fine story, Frank, but a notice about cellars in a town 40 miles off does not prove much about a hole behind Martha's barn." "No," Frank agreed. "It does not prove it. It only makes it possible. Proving it will take more digging than the kind we are doing with shovels." They resumed digging that afternoon, and by evening they had cleared the archway enough for a person to pass through, crouched low, into the space beyond. Walter went first, carrying a lantern, with Martha close behind him. The chamber inside was larger than Martha had expected, roughly 15 feet across, and lined with the same carefully cut stone as the steps outside. The air was cold, colder even than the ground above, and carried a faint mineral smell that reminded her of well water. Along one wall stood the remains of wooden shelving, mostly collapsed and rotted after decades of disuse. And scattered across the floor were the broken remnants of clay jars and glass jars, some still intact, their contents long since evaporated or turned to dust. "Would you look at that?" Walter said quietly, holding the lantern up toward the far wall. Carved into the stone, faint but legible, was a series of numbers and initials, apparently marking off sections of the cellar that had once belonged to different families. "Rationing marks," Frank said, examining them closely. "Each family got their allotted section. Makes sense if 5 households were sharing one space. You would need some system to keep track of whose preserves were whose." Martha ran her hand along the cold stone wall, thinking of the families who must have gathered here each autumn, carrying down jars of preserved vegetables and cured meat, working together in the cold and the dark to prepare for a winter that none of them could have survived alone. It was a different kind of labor than the labor she knew, the solitary work of running a ranch by herself, and something about it moved her in a way she did not fully expect.
Any way to know which families? She asked. Frank studied the carved initials for a long moment. Some of these match names I've seen in the old church registry. I would need to go through my records more carefully, but I believe I recognize at least 2 family names here. If you're willing to wait, I can find out for certain. Before he left that evening, Martha asked whether it might also be worth consulting a stonemason, someone who could speak to how the steps had been cut and roughly how long ago the work had been done. Frank agreed this was a reasonable idea, and a week later, a mason named Otis Barrow rode out from the county seat to examine the archway and the steps for himself. Otis spent nearly 2 hours running his hands along the chisel marks, measuring the depth of the cuts with a folding rule he carried in his coat pocket, and comparing the mortar between certain stones to samples he had seen in other old structures across the territory. "This is not recent work," he said finally, straightening up and brushing dust from his knees. "The tool marks match a style I have only seen in structures built before the war. Whoever cut these steps knew what they were doing. This was not a man digging a hole for himself. This was a man building something meant to hold weight and hold cold for a long time." "How long is a long time?" Martha asked. "Judging by the wear on the stone and the settling of the mortar, I would guess 25 to 35 years at minimum since this cellar was last disturbed, possibly longer. It is hard to say exact without more to go on, but that would put its last use somewhere well before the war ended, maybe not long after it began." This matched, more or less, with what Frank had already suspected from the newspaper notice, and it gave Martha a strange comfort to have the guess of an old newspaper clipping confirmed by the plain evidence of the stone itself. It took Frank the better part of a week, working through his boxes of collected documents, cross-referencing land claims and church records, and the scattered notices he had accumulated over the years, before he returned to Martha's ranch with a full accounting. 5 families, he said, spreading his notes across her kitchen table. The Pruitts, obviously, since Owen built it and would have used it himself before he sold the land. The Doss family. He glanced up at Walter, who had come along to hear the report. "Your grandfather, if I am reading this correctly." Walter went quiet for a moment. "My grandfather never mentioned any of this." "Might not have thought it worth mentioning," Frank said, "or might have simply forgotten by the time he had grandchildren old enough to care about such things. There is also a family by the name of Whitfield, one by the name of Voss, and one more I could not fully identify. The initials do not match anything clean in my records." "What happened to all of them?" "Whitfields moved to California sometime in the 1860s, according to what I could find. The Voss family, I believe, is still in the territory somewhere, though I could not say exactly where without more digging. As for the rest, I could not tell you. People scattered. That is simply what happened out here." Martha sat with this information for a long moment, looking down at the notes Frank had spread across her table, thinking about the strange thread that had connected her home, without her ever knowing it, to 4 other families across the span of nearly 4 decades, long before she herself had ever arrived on this land. "I would like to find the Voss family, if they are still nearby," she said finally. "If any of them are still living, I think they ought to know their grandparents' cellar has been found." It took another 2 weeks of asking around, sending letters through Frank's network of contacts across the territory, before word came back that a woman named Ruth Voss, granddaughter of one of the original families, was living on a small farm 60 miles to the south. Martha wrote to her directly, explaining what had been found behind her barn, and received a reply within the month, expressing a desire to see it herself. Ruth arrived on a gray afternoon in early autumn, an older woman with silver hair pulled back beneath a plain bonnet, accompanied by her adult son, who had driven the wagon the full distance. She stood at the edge of the excavation for a long moment before speaking. "My grandmother used to talk about this place," she said quietly. "Not often, but sometimes, in the winter, when the wind was bad, she would say she missed the old cellar. Said it kept things colder than anything they had since. Said the families used to take turns keeping watch on it, making sure nothing was disturbed." "Would you like to see inside?" Martha asked. Ruth nodded, and the two women descended the 11 stone steps together, Martha holding the lantern this time, into the cold chamber below. Ruth ran her fingers along the carved initials on the far wall until she found the mark that corresponded to her family name. "There it is," she said softly. V.O. Voss and O'Brien, my grandmother's maiden name and my grandfather's name together. They must have carved it the year they married." She was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting against the cold stone. "My grandmother always said the hardest years out here were not the ones with the worst winters. They were the years right after they arrived, before they had anyone to lean on. She said finding this cellar, finding these other families willing to share the work and share the space, was the thing that made the difference between surviving and not surviving." "Do you know why it was sealed up?" Martha asked. "Why nobody used it after Pruitt left?" Ruth considered this. "My grandmother said the families drifted apart, the way families do. Some moved on, chasing better land or better luck further west. Some just grew apart the way neighbors sometimes do after enough years pass. She said the last time she came down here, she and one other woman covered the entrance with brush themselves, so the animals would not fall in. I imagine that is your 40 years of brush, right there. Nobody meant for it to become a secret. It simply stopped being needed, and time did the rest." They climbed back up into the daylight, and Ruth stood for a while at the top of the stone steps, looking out over the pasture where Martha's cattle grazed in the distance. "Thank you for finding it," Ruth said, "and for finding me. I did not expect, at my age, to stand in the same place my grandmother stood all those years ago." Before she left that day, Ruth mentioned that she still had a small trunk of her grandmother's belongings back home, and that she recalled, though she could not be certain, a mention of the cellar somewhere in a bundle of old letters. She promised to look and to write again if she found anything worth sharing. True to her word, a letter arrived from Ruth some 3 weeks later, along with a copied page from one of her grandmother's letters, dated the spring of 1862. In careful, faded handwriting, the letter described a gathering held at the cellar the previous autumn. 5 families bringing what they could spare, working through the better part of 2 days to fill the space with enough stores to see each household through to spring. The letter spoke plainly of hard winters and harder years, but also of a particular warmth in knowing that no family stood entirely alone against the cold. Word of the discovery spread through the territory over the following weeks, as word tends to do, and Martha found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, hosting a small gathering behind her barn one Sunday afternoon in late autumn. Walter came, along with his wife and his grown children. Frank came with his boxes of records, eager to show anyone interested the full accounting of what he had found. Robert Finch came as well, considerably less skeptical than he had been at the start, And even Otis the stonemason rode out again, curious to see the cellar with its history now more fully known. Ruth Foss returned as well, this time with 2 of her grandchildren in tow, curious to see the cellar their great-great-grandparents had helped build. They stood together at the edge of the excavation as the afternoon light slanted low across the pasture, and Frank read aloud from the old newspaper notice he had found, the one describing the cooperative cellar system that families like the Pruitts and the Dosses and the Vosses had built together out of necessity, out of the simple fact that no single family could survive a hard winter entirely alone. "It is a strange thing," Walter said, standing beside Martha as the gathering slowly began to disperse toward evening. "All these years my own family has lived 2 miles from this spot, and I never knew my grandfather had a hand in building something like this." "Nor did I know any of it," Martha said. "I have been on this land only 4 years, and I never once thought to look beneath the brush behind my own barn." "What will you do with it now?" Martha considered the question for a long moment, looking down at the cold stone steps disappearing into the earth, thinking of the families who had once gathered there in the depths of winter, sharing what little they had so that none of them would have to face the cold alone. "I do not rightly know," she said. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I will just leave the steps uncovered so that anyone who wants to remember what was here can come and see it. It does not seem right to bury it again." That evening, after everyone had gone, Martha stood alone behind her barn as the sun set over the pasture, the cold stone steps visible now in the fading light, where 40 years of brush had once hidden them from sight. She thought about how close she had come to burning that brush pile without ever suspecting what lay beneath it, and how easily the whole thing might have stayed buried forever, the way so much of the past simply disappears beneath the accumulated weight of ordinary years, until nobody is left who remembers it at all. She thought, too, about the difference between the life she was building now, young and alone on land still unfamiliar to her, and the world those 5 families had built their cellar to survive. She had a hired hand who came twice a week, a nephew of Everett's who visited when it suited him, and a solitary kind of independence that Everett's death had forced upon her far sooner than she had ever imagined it would. But those families, all those years ago, had built something together that none of them could have built alone, cutting stone steps deep into the cold earth so that 4 or 5 households could share what one household alone might not have survived. She wondered whether anyone today would think to do the same, whether there was still that same instinct for shared labor and shared survival, or whether it had faded along with the cooperative cellars and the hand-cut stone steps and the names carved quietly into cold stone walls. She thought of Ruth's grandmother's letter, of the plain warmth in those few faded sentences, and wondered how many other such letters sat forgotten in trunks across the territory, holding small histories that nobody had thought to go looking for. She latched the barn door for the evening and turned to look one last time at the exposed steps before walking back toward the house. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the last of the ash from the extinguished brush fire out across the darkening pasture, and for a moment she could almost imagine the sound of voices from long ago, the low murmur of neighbors working together in the cold, carrying jars of preserves down 11 stone steps into a shared darkness that had once meant the difference between hunger and enough. What might be waiting beneath the ordinary, overlooked corners of your own life if you ever took the trouble to burn away the years of brush that have quietly piled up on top of it? If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving it a like, subscribing to the channel for more true tales of the American frontier, and leaving a comment below sharing what you thought of Martha's discovery. Thank you for watching.